There is a moment in this story that deserves to be held up before anything else is said. A man picked up his phone and called his ex-girlfriend's estranged husband. Not once, not twice, 20 times. And in those calls he said the same thing over and over with enough clarity and enough repetition that there could be no confusion about what he meant. He said, "When I see your wife, I am going to kill her." He said it the first time. He called back and said it again. He called back and said it a third time. He kept calling, 20 times. And on the other end of those calls was a man who had no legal power to stop what was coming, who told his estranged wife everything he had heard, who passed along every word of every threat, and who watched helplessly as the system processed none of it into the intervention that might have saved Latrice Morris Dorsey's life. 2 weeks after those calls, Earl Maxwell walked into Latrice's home on Avon Avenue on the west side of Detroit. It was Father's Day, June 18, 2017. Her 4-year-old daughter Jada was in the room. Her 14-year-old son Justin was down the hall with his Xbox headphones on. And Latrice Morris Dorsey, 42 years old, a physical therapist, mother of 3, a woman her family described as beautiful inside and out, was shot multiple times in her own home. The warning had been given, it had been heard, it had been passed along, and it had not been enough. Welcome to Behind the Evidence. This channel goes past the headline and into the full picture, the psychology, the warning signs, the moments where intervention was possible and didn't happen, and the people behind every case we cover. If you are new here, subscribe now. We bring stories like this one every week because these are the stories that demand to be told long after the news cycle has moved on. Now let's go back to the beginning. Latrice Morris Dorsey grew up in Detroit, Michigan. By the time she reached her 40s, she had built a life that reflected everything she put into it. She was a licensed physical therapist, a profession that requires years of education, sustained clinical training, and the specific kind of patient dedication that is not something you perform but something you carry. She worked with people who were in pain, people who were trying to rebuild physical function after injury or illness, people who needed someone in their corner who understood the body and believed in its capacity to recover. That is not a job for someone who lacks empathy or endurance. It is a job for someone who genuinely cares. And by every account from the people who knew Latrice, that is exactly what she was. She had 3 children of her own and 3 stepchildren. She was close to her family, particularly her father James Morris and her sister Megan, who would become the loudest and most heartbroken voices in the immediate aftermath of her death. She had an estranged husband, Paul Dorsey, from whom she was separated, but with whom she maintained enough of a connection that he would ultimately become one of the most important witnesses in the case against the man who killed her. And she had recently made a decision that many women in difficult relationships make, and that research consistently identifies as one of the most dangerous moments in any intimate partnership. She had left. Earl Maxwell was 37 years old when he killed Latrice Morris Dorsey. The two had been together for 4 years. By the spring of 2017, Latrice had ended the relationship and moved to a home on Avon Avenue on the west side of Detroit, a deliberate step away from Maxwell and toward the kind of fresh start that she had every right to pursue. She had cut her phone off so he could not reach her directly. She was creating distance, physically and communicatively, in exactly the way that domestic violence advocates tell people to when they are trying to exit a relationship that no longer feels safe. But here is the reality that those same advocates also understand, and that the research documents with painful consistency. Leaving does not immediately produce safety. In many cases, it produces the opposite. The act of separation, of a woman asserting her right to exist outside of a relationship that a controlling partner has defined as his territory, can trigger an escalation in the very partner who has been the source of danger. The loss of access, the loss of control, the loss of the ability to monitor and manage and possess the person they have organized their sense of power around, can produce a response that is far more dangerous than the relationship itself had been. This pattern has a name in the research literature. It is called separation violence, and it is what killed Latry's Morris Dorsey. Maxwell could not reach her directly because she had cut off her phone, so he found the next available contact, her estranged husband, Paul Dorsey, and he called him, over and over and over again, 20 times according to Paul's own testimony. He called because she had cut her phone off, and the only person he could get in touch with was the man whose name she still carried. And in those calls he made his intentions clear with a directness that is almost difficult to process in hindsight. He said, "When I see your wife, I am going to kill her." He said it the first time. He called back and said it again. He called back again after that. Paul Dorsey told Latry's everything. He passed along every call, every threat, every word that Maxwell had said. He told her from the beginning to when Maxwell eventually cooled down and changed his tone, calling back at some point to say, "Let us get this business together," to walk back the threats in the way that escalating partners frequently do when they sense that the window for approach is closing. Latry's heard all of it. Her family heard it. And 2 weeks after those calls, Maxwell showed up at her door. What drew Maxwell back to Avon Avenue that Father's Day evening? What specific trigger sent him from the extended phone campaign against her husband to the act of showing up at her home is something the trial testimony addressed in part. Evidence presented at court revealed that Latry's had possibly begun seeing someone else. That detail, the possibility that she had moved on, that she was living a life that did not include Earl Maxwell, is what prosecutors identified as the source of his escalation. He was not simply a man who was grieving the end of a relationship. He was a man who believed that Latry's Morris Dorsey was his, that her choices required his approval, that her movement toward someone else was an act done to him rather than a choice made for herself. That framework, the belief that a partner is property rather than a person, is at the core of every case of intimate partner homicide that this channel has covered. It is not unique to Earl Maxwell. It is a pattern that runs through these cases with a consistency that is both predictable and, precisely because it is predictable, all the more devastating when it produces the outcome it almost always produces. Maxwell arrived at Latry's home on the evening of June 18, 2017. Inside that home were her children. Jada, 4 years old, was in the room where her mother was. Justin, 14 years old, was down the hall in another room, headphones on, engaged in the specific and ordinary adolescent ritual of playing video games on a Sunday evening. Neither of them had any reason to understand what was about to happen. Neither of them had any framework for processing the sound they were about to hear, or the reality it would introduce into their lives in a way that would never fully leave. According to Maxwell's own statement, given after his arrest, he claimed he had come to Latry's home to drop off a car part. He said he only produced his firearm because he was trying to reach a cigarette lighter that was in his pocket, and the gun was in the way. He said that, when he stood up to invite Latry's to come onto the porch, she pulled him toward her, thinking she was going to hug him. He said his gun was in his right hand, and she grabbed his wrist, and the gun twisted and began firing. He said the gun went off continuously. He said it was an accident. He said he accidentally shot Latry's Morris Dorsey 10 times. That statement, delivered by a detective reading from Maxwell's own written account in court, is one of those moments in a trial where the silence of the room says everything that words cannot. 10 times. An accident. A gun that went off while a woman allegedly grabbed his wrist and spun it around, firing continuously, 10 separate times, into the body of a 42-year-old woman while her 4-year-old daughter stood in the same room. The prosecution did not need to spend much time dismantling that account. The physical reality of 10 gunshot wounds tells its own story about the probability of an accident, and the 20 phone calls to her estranged husband, the explicit threats repeated across those calls, the documented escalation over the 2 weeks leading up to that evening, told another story that Maxwell's explanation had no room to absorb. Inside that house, in those seconds after the shots stopped, Time fractured into two separate realities that would define the rest of the lives of the two children present. Jada, 4 years old, did not fully understand what she had seen in the way that an adult would understand it, but she understood enough. She understood that her mother was hurt. She understood that something terrible had happened. She got up and she went down the hall. She found her brother, and she told him what she knew. Mommy has been shot. Justin pulled off his headphones. He had heard sounds while he was playing, sounds that in the context of a Sunday evening in a residential Detroit neighborhood, he had processed as background noise, as the ordinary sonic texture of city life, because nothing in his 14 years had given him a reason to identify those specific sounds as something that required immediate action inside his own home. When his little sister came through the door and said those 4 words, everything reframed instantly. He ran. He found his mother, and he did what a 14-year-old boy does when he finds his mother on the floor, which was everything he could think of. He tried to help her. He called for help. He yelled. Neighbors heard him. Ron Wilson, who lived nearby, was one of the first people to respond to Justin's calls for help. He ran inside the home. He found Latry's Morris doors, and he performed CPR while they waited for medical help to arrive. He told reporters afterward what he experienced in those moments, that as he gave her CPR, she took her last 2 breaths. He was with her when she died, a neighbor who had done nothing more than respond to the sound of a child screaming for his mother. Justin had also seen something in those chaotic moments. He had seen someone running from the home. He saw a man leaving through the door and getting into a dark-colored vehicle and driving away. He told police what he had seen. That description, combined with the prior phone calls to Paul Dorsey and the documented history of Maxwell's threats, gave investigators a clear and immediate direction for their inquiry. Earl Maxwell did not run far. He turned himself in to the Detroit police on June 20, 2017, 2 days after killing Latry's Morris Dorsey. Wayne County prosecutor Kim Worthy filed charges of first-degree murder and a felony firearms violation. Maxwell was arraigned on June 22, appearing in court via video link. He shook his head as the charges were read. He said nothing. Prosecutor Worthy, who had already made a name for herself as one of the most persistent and clear-eyed voices on intimate partner violence in Wayne County, issued a statement that cut directly to what made this case particularly devastating beyond the tragedy of Latry's death itself. She said what made the allegations especially disturbing was that the crime was committed in the presence of one of the deceased's children and within earshot of another. She said those children would have to live with what they experienced for the rest of their lives. That statement from Prosecutor Worthy is worth sitting with carefully because it identifies something that goes beyond the immediate legal charges and into the long arc of harm that cases like this one produce. The murder of a parent in front of a child is not a single traumatic event. It is the beginning of a process that shapes that child's entire subsequent development. The research on children who witness parental homicide, which we covered this territory in an earlier case on this channel, consistently shows elevated rates of post-traumatic stress, depression, anxiety, and long-term difficulty forming stable attachments. Jada, who was 4 years old, was at a developmental stage where the trauma of what she witnessed would be processed and reprocessed as she grows, showing up in different forms at different ages as her capacity to understand what she saw catches up to the memory of having seen it. Justin, who was 14, had the cognitive framework to understand exactly what had happened, and the emotional weight of that understanding lands differently, heavier in some ways, on an adolescent who has just lost a parent in the most violent and preventable way imaginable. What Justin did in the aftermath of his mother's death is something that deserves to be part of this story. He did not collapse into grief in a way that stopped the world from moving. He kept going. He finished school, and he fulfilled a wish that Latry's had expressed for him. The details of exactly what that wish was have been shared in community tributes to the family in the years since her death, but the significance of it, The act of a son carrying his mother's hope forward after everything that was taken from him is one of the few things in this entire case that holds any light at all. Back in the courtroom, the legal process moved through its stages with Maxwell maintaining his accidental shooting account into the preliminary examination phase of the proceedings. The trial testimony included the reading of his statement by Detective Sergeant Derek Griffin, who walked the court through Maxwell's claim that the gun discharged continuously while Latries was grabbing his wrist. It included Paul Dorsey's testimony about the 20 calls and the explicit threats made across those calls. It included testimony about the evidence at the scene, the spent shell casings, the physical evidence of a woman shot multiple times in her own home, and the forensic picture that contradicted the word accident in every possible dimension. And it included a detail that had circulated in early reporting on the case, and that speaks to the specific psychological territory Earl Maxwell occupied in relation to Latries Morris Dorsey. He had a tattoo. On his left arm in ink was her name, Latries, permanent, visible, carried on his body as a declaration of possession and connection. The man who claimed the gun went off accidentally. The man who called her estranged husband 20 times saying he would kill her. The man who showed up at her home on Father's Day with a firearm was also a man who had branded himself with the name of the woman he said he loved. That tattoo is not evidence of love. It is evidence of obsession, of the specific, dangerous variety of attachment that does not recognize the other person's right to exist independently, to make their own choices, to leave. The kind of attachment that frames love as ownership and departure, as betrayal deserving of punishment. Earl Maxwell ultimately pleaded guilty to second-degree murder in May of 2018. The original first-degree murder charge carried with it a mandatory sentence of life without the possibility of parole. The plea to second-degree murder allowed for a sentencing range, and on June 7, 2018, Maxwell was sentenced to 25 to 50 years in the Michigan Department of Corrections. He was 38 years old at sentencing. Under that sentence structure, he will be in his 60s at the absolute earliest before he becomes eligible for parole consideration. Given the nature of the crime, the explicit prior threats, and the presence of children during the killing, there is no guarantee that parole consideration will produce release even at that point. Latries' father, James Morris, 72 years old at the time of her death, said something in the immediate aftermath that carries the specific weight of a parent's grief compressed into a single image. He said he had 3 daughters, 3 beautiful daughters, and that Maxwell had put a hole in his heart. James Morris was also aware of the additional cruelty of the timing, that the call telling him his daughter was gone came on Father's Day. The one day of the year when fathers are supposed to be celebrated by their children, when the relationship between a parent and their family is held up and honored, was the day Earl Maxwell chose to take one of James Morris's daughters from him. Latries' sister, Megan Morris, was present in media coverage from the earliest days after the murder, speaking about her sister with a combination of grief and rage that she made no effort to soften for the cameras. She said she hated that Maxwell had the power to take that life, to take it from Latries herself, from her kids, from her father on Father's Day. She said the word clearly, coward. That is what she called the man who showed up at her sister's home with a gun on a Sunday evening. Not a tragedy, not a complicated situation, a coward. And in the simplicity of that word, there is a moral clarity that no amount of legal procedure and sentencing analysis can produce as efficiently. The case of Latries Morris Dorsey sits inside a much larger and much older pattern that is worth naming directly. The United States does not have a domestic violence problem. It has a domestic homicide epidemic. Every year, intimate partner violence accounts for a significant percentage of all homicides in this country. The majority of victims are women. The majority of perpetrators are current or former male partners. And the period of highest risk, documented consistently across decades of research, is the period immediately following separation. The period when Latries Morris Dorsey was in. The period when she had done everything she was supposed to do, ended the relationship, moved to a new home, cut off contact, and was building a new life. The warning signs in this case were not subtle. They were spoken out loud, 20 times into a phone, to a man who passed every word of them along to the person they were directed at. They were not the ambiguous, deniable signals that investigators sometimes have to piece together after the fact. They were explicit. They were repeated. They were documented in the testimony of an eyewitness who had heard them firsthand. And still, within the structure of what law enforcement can legally do when a threat is communicated but no crime has yet been committed, there was not a mechanism in place that was sufficient to prevent what happened on Avon Avenue on Father's Day. This is not an argument against law enforcement. It is an argument for the resources and legal frameworks that advocates have been pushing for decades. Lethality assessment protocols that give responding officers a structured tool for evaluating the risk level of a domestic situation and connecting high-risk individuals with immediate intervention. Emergency protective order processes can be activated based on credible prior threats rather than waiting for a threshold of physical harm to be crossed. Community-based safety planning that reaches victims where they are and helps them access resources that the system is too slow to deploy on its own. These tools exist. They are not universally implemented. They are not universally funded. And the gap between where they exist and where they are needed is measured, in cases like this one, in lives. Latrice Morris Dorsey was 42 years old. She was a physical therapist who spent her working life helping people heal. She was a mother of 3 who her father described simply, and with a grief that needs no elaboration, as beautiful. She had made the right choice when she ended a relationship that had become dangerous. She had communicated the right information to the right people. She had moved. She had taken her children with her to a new home and tried to build something clean and forward-facing out of the wreckage of a relationship that Earl Maxwell could not accept was over. She did not survive the attempt, but the attempt was right, and the failure of the systems around her to respond to a threat that was stated clearly and repeatedly is not a reflection on the choices she made. It is a reflection on what those systems still owe to women who are trying to do exactly what Latrice Morris Dorsey was doing. Her name was Latrice Morris Dorsey. Her daughter Jada was in the room. Her son Justin pulled off his headphones when his little sister came running. Her father got a phone call on Father's Day that put a hole in his heart that nothing will ever fully close. Her neighbor Ron Wilson gave her CPR and felt her take her last 2 breaths. And Earl Maxwell, who called 20 times to say he would do it and then did it, is sitting in a Michigan prison where he will spend the better part of the rest of his life. Justice was delivered, but it was delivered too late for the person who needed it most, and that is the weight this case leaves behind. If someone in your life has made explicit threats against another person, please take that seriously. Please document it, please report it, and please reach out to the National Domestic Violence Hotline at 1-800-799-7233. Free, confidential, available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, by call, text, and chat at thehotline.org. Subscribe to Behind the Evidence. Share this for Latrice, and share it for the next person who makes a phone call to the wrong person or says something to the wrong family member and doesn't know what to do with what they've heard. Threats are not words, they are evidence. Treat them that way. Behind the evidence, there is always more, and we are always going to find it.